This panel aims to show that chaotic systems can be converted into coherent ones, not just in physics, but in the real world too. That's a bit of the nerd in me coming out. Only this time, the external forces needed for that transformation are not laser pulses, like in physics, but it's the youth. So to moderate this panel, we welcome back to the stage our favorite, Asanka de Mel, founder of Lovi and co-chair for Big Bold Brave 2025. Joining Asanka on this discourse is Pial Islam, Bhavani Fonseka, Dr. Harinda Vidanage, and Aritha Wickramasinghe. Panelists, please make your way to the stage as I introduce you. Pial Islam is a strategy advisor with over 25 years of global experience spanning North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. He's the managing director of PI Strategy, delivering impactful advisory services to over 50 clients, including the World Bank, the Gates Foundation, and various governments on initiatives covering financial inclusion and systemic challenges. His work is internationally published by Harvard and the World Economic Forum. Bhavani Fonseka is a senior researcher and lawyer with the Center for Policy Alternatives in Sri Lanka. Presently, her work focuses on transitional justice issues in post-war Sri Lanka. She has worked in the areas of human rights, peace building, reconciliation, and the rule of law, and appeared as counsel in several leading cases in the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka. Dr. Harinda Vidanage, who is back on stage with us, is the director of the Center for Strategic Assessment at KDU and a senior advisor for the Center for Law and Security Studies in Sri Lanka. Aritha Wickramasinghe is a distinguished international finance lawyer who has advised the UN and the British government and has been instrumental in public policy reform in Sri Lanka. A passionate advocate for social justice, he is a respected voice on topics such as human rights, equality, and public policy. He was ranked by the Financial Times as a top global LGBT future leader, highlighting his leadership and influence. Our panelists are experts in politics, public finance, and civic leadership, and they will be unpacking how youth-driven reforms can strengthen fragile systems and rebuild trust in government. Asanka, over to you.
Thank you. Welcome back from lunch, and thank you for the reset. Well, the bad idea is I reset it. I can't remember anything I was going to ask you guys. Good thing I wrote some questions down. So the last 2 days so far, we've been talking a lot about economics and what's happening in the world in energy, jobs, environment. But in this panel, I want to change, and we've taken this idea that democracy and governance is going to be just here or underlying principle. But democracy and governance itself is changing. And I wanted to bring out this aspect so that all of you can, not take it for granted also. The focus is on Sri Lanka had essentially a youth-led change of government. Bangladesh recently is going through one. Nepal is there. I think Morocco or Madagascar, several countries are going through, and it kind of is, in a certain way, it's like an Arab Spring, but it is happening. So, it itself is changing the idea of democracy or even the governance structure itself. On top of that, we have a big shift as Gen Z and millennials become large part of the voting bloc. Their expectations and how they see the future of governance is self-changing. A third change is we have seen, at least especially in northern countries, a shift from more liberal politics to more rightward politics. So all of these kind of things are happening. So the good part is the governance itself is evolving. And this panel's purpose is to kind of give you some light, particularly related to understanding how these changes will affect us over the next 25 years in terms of our country's governance. So start off, I will have my friend Pial, who's going to talk about Bangladesh and what he's seeing over there. So Pial has a presentation, and he's going to present it from the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that introduction and context setting, Asanka. I'll take a few minutes. I know some of you, through our lunch and drinks discussions, we know you've been to Bangladesh, you're familiar with the situation that it went through, but I wanted to sort of set the stage to quick narration on what happened in the last 16 months and how and where we are today. So 36 July 2024. That's not a typo you see on that screen. For the rest of the world, July ends on the 31st of the month. But for Bangladesh, history took a different turn. In early July 2024, an uprising that was later immortalized as the Monsoon Revolution swept the nation. The youth of Bangladesh, undeterred, would not allow the month of July to end until their voices were heard and Sheikh Hasina's autocratic regime was brought to its knees. It took them 5 more days, but those 5 days rewrote our calendar, our national calendar for good. And 5th August is therefore forever etched in our collective memory as 36 July. Now, I wanted to show some pictures. I'll primarily be doing some, talking through pictures here. But a quick quote, and someone, this quote, I won't read it out, you can hopefully read it from the back as well. But the reason I picked this, I think it captures the youthful defiance and the boundless power of imagination for the youth to be able to change and make impossible possible. Now, during the Monsoon Revolution, technology, unsurprisingly, was both a weapon and a witness. From the very beginning, the movement's heartbeat resonated on social media. Facebook Reels documented 15 years of oppression from the previous regime. And when sometime in late July, a specific event happened that really ignited the nation. A young student named Abu Said was shot dead by the police in the orders of the then Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina. And instantly, the digital world lit fire. Songs of protest resonated and reverberated through WhatsApp groups and social media, echoing through dorm rooms and alleyways across the country. And when the fascist regime of Sheikh Hasina tried to silence the people by shutting down the internet for 2-3 days, the youth would not give up. Armed with pocket routers that instantly created VPNs on the fly, they stayed connected and they kept the movement alive. The youth continued to play an important role moving forward as well. But the price of the freedom that Bangladesh and the youth paid was both through sacrifice and blood. A separate and independent UN assessment later on identified that over 1,400 people were killed during the uprising. Over 10,000 people were injured. And to the best of at least my knowledge, I have not seen in modern times any single leader of a nation killing 1,400 of their own people in such a short time. But we witnessed that in Bangladesh. And yet the protests rolled on, unstoppable and unbroken. In the pictures on the screen, you see a lot of different people on the street, young, old, men, women, people in from all faiths, all walks of life. They were all on the street. The youth continued to play a really important role post-July 36 as well. They helped us find the next leader for the interim government. That was Professor Muhammad Yunus, a Nobel laureate. He took charge on the 8th of August. And even in the cabinet, in the interim government that he formed, there were 3 members from the youth movement that were represented. The interim government was given a broad mandate, in addition to smooth transition through an election, but they also had a mandate to do transitional justice and accountability, some institutional reform, and of course, holding a free and fair election that is now scheduled for early February 2026 in Bangladesh. The interim government formed a number of commissions that looked at a whole bunch of different reform issues, covering from police reform, judicial reform, and others. They also formed a series of task forces. The task forces were very focused and on the economic space and the financial sector. And specifically, a banking sector reform task force was formed by the central bank governor. And I was fortunate enough to be part of that task force looking at the massive problems in our banking sector. What we found, while not unsurprising, was nothing short of a series of Gordian knots. And everywhere we looked, there were trouble, and especially with many of the banks. I'll give you a quick couple of examples. The NPL, the non-performing loan in the banking sector, for some of the ailing banks, reached as high as 80%. 80% NPL is something that's, global standard is if you reach 30%, you're in a crisis mode. In Bangladesh, several banks crossed the 80% mark. There was massive liquidity crisis. People were going and lining up outside banks. There was no money for them to withdraw from their bank accounts. And in terms of money laundered and the wealth stolen, the estimate is over the 15-year of Sheikh Hasina's regime, over $200 billion were siphoned off from the country. Now, to put that in context, that's roughly, 2 times the GDP of the country we're in. So massive theft, massive malgovernance, and massive corruption led to all of that. So how did we try to address them? Here's a couple of quick things. One, we looked at existing regulations, made changes to make them align with global best practices. We also introduced new regulations, one specifically called Bank Resolution Ordinance, that figured out how to address ailing banks, so using bail-ins and bailouts and liquidation and mergers and acquisition. We took very deep dives on the existing problem to assess the size of the hole, and AQRs, or asset quality reviews, were conducted for a number of banks in batches. And we took specific resolution measures, like changing the boards of some of these banks, providing emergency liquidity support to the tune of $2.5–3 billion, and moving forward with one of the largest merger and acquisition initiative in the country, where we're putting together 5 different banks into one fairly large, initially public sector, but eventually private sector bank. Now, what did we learn that we can share with all of you? We recognize these financial crises are not unique, unfortunately, to Bangladesh. We see this in many places around the world. But what are a couple of things that we see that are common? So one, when you have very difficult politicization of institutions and checks and balances are overlooked, these kind of inevitable disasters happen. And some ways to address that is to create sort of disassociate the influence of the political parties and political masters on the central bank itself. So we're currently going through a process to create the central bank as an independent organization. The other thing we also learned, that the money laundered, this $200 billion, is highly unlikely it's going to come back in fully. And even if that does, it's going to take a very long time. But quite surprisingly, we notice that the fund flight destination, so where these stolen monies were siphoned off to, those countries aren't that many. Among the 100+ countries in the world, most of these monies went through 5 or 6 countries. So if we could figure out a way to do preemptive monitoring, tracking, and tracing of these funds before some of these things happen, maybe there is a way to at least avoid these happening in the future. And last but not least, we also realize that in terms of the governance failures that we see, it's not necessarily or highly unlikely to be by chance or by accident. These are often well thought out, meticulously planned, and with an intent. So from that perspective, independent boards, whistleblowing mechanisms, all of those could help. And the last comment on this topic is, if we look at what are sort of the root causes across the nation, I was looking at both Bangladesh, but also Nepal and Sri Lanka, what we interestingly see is in many of these countries, few dynasties, families that continue to rule these lands over a long period of time. Which, at least in the case of Bangladesh, the Sheikh family and the Zia family have alternated ruling us for the last 53 years. Stories might be similar in Sri Lanka and Nepal as well. So these dynasties, as we lovingly call them, Nepo babies, coming from the Hollywood, Bollywood example of children of stars becoming stars really quickly. So these Nepo babies have been ruling us for the last, half a century, at least in Bangladesh. So we need to figure out a way, and that's where the youth sort of come in. Now, the struggle for the youth in Bangladesh has not gone unrecognized globally. Shortly after 36 July, oops, there got the wrong slide. Okay, here. Shortly after 36 July, Economist featured Bangladesh on its cover. And then towards the end of the year, they named Bangladesh the country of the year 2024 because of the struggle and the struggle we went through and the promise we represented. With that, I will conclude with a quick 1-minute video, if that can be played. Thank you.
Scenic beauty, centuries-old heritage, archaeological sites, and natural wonders, valuable and precious. But what's more precious is the people. Their honesty, warm nature, hard work, and resilience.
রবি বন্ধুর রাতে রাঙা বন্দিশালার ওই শিকল ভাঙা তারাকে
This is what brought us July. This is what made us stand together and protect each other. When the country was literally without any visible police force. And this is the very spirit which brought us together in the face of a natural disaster which came right after the July uprising. This is what makes the world trust our hard-working people. This is what brought the people of Bangladesh the Economist Country of the Year Award for 2024. Here is to a better future for both Bangladesh and the world.
Thanks, Pial. Well, it's very clear how much he loves this country. And I know it was very, very difficult the past few years. I want to switch to Bhavani over here because Bhavani, we went through this in Sri Lanka, and it was perhaps less bloody than in the case of Bangladesh. But can you not only give a little brief about what happened, but what have we learned and what are we changing out of it?
Thank you, Asanka. And it's kind of good to follow from Bangladesh because what you went through, I mean, we went through something similar in 2022, but the difference was it was relatively peaceful. But I think this is something we all need to recognize is that Sri Lanka has a history of activism, mobilization. It's a point I want to get to. And what we saw in 2022 was an economic crisis, a governance crisis, and that sparked an unprecedented movement across Sri Lanka, but largely in Colombo, all age groups came out to the streets calling, and this kind of demand of system change, because the economic crisis was in the backdrop of corruption, kind of mismanagement, the whole system collapsing. And I go back to this point that Asanka started off this session of governance and democracy. And though the articulation would have been very much a change in political culture, change in governance, people wanted something different. And I think that's the kind of crux of it. What happened in 2022 is all age groups, it wasn't just the young, all age groups, different backgrounds coming together and sustaining that call. But it's also very important to understand, compared to some other countries, we've seen the protests, but the impact being different is Sri Lanka had a history, decades of mobilization. And we can unpack that a bit more later, but it's very important to understand that it builds on decades of work. So this didn't happen in a vacuum. And the reforms and the changes that have happened since 2022, I think also speaks to that, that we've been able to sustain some of those conversations, discussions, and really have a go at a change in democracy and governance because there is this kind of conversation across different groups. And that's an important point to remember.
Thank you. I want to follow in Sri Lanka, since it's a little bit more advanced, or at least earlier than happened. Part of the call for this change is, large amount of reform. I want Aritha, who's been working both in several of the Sri Lankan administrations, to speak about possibly the possibility even and the difficulty, even when we agree on getting reform, how to make it happen actually.
Thanks, Asanka. I mean, 2022 was a very unique moment in Sri Lanka's history. That sort of deep economic and financial crisis we have never experienced in our history. And second, the political crisis, which came at the same time, was also something which we had never experienced. Bhavani already touched on how that mobilized the wider population to demand change. And what do we mean by change? Right? Change means reform. You have to make the difficult decisions to do things differently to what you have been doing all this time. So there was, in some ways, a mandate, not necessarily an electoral mandate, for people, for the new leadership to undertake those difficult reforms. And I think it was also very unique because I clearly remember during the protests outside Gulf Face, there were actually people demanding that the IMF come in and intervene. Usually no one goes and protests demanding for the IMF to get involved. But our finances were terrible, right? And our politicians and leadership had shown that they really couldn't manage these finances properly. So we went back to the IMF for the 17th or 18th time to help us restructure this economy. And I was involved in that process. I am still involved in that process. And we've had to make some of these sort of critical changes and to identify what are the structural issues in the Sri Lankan economy which has caused this financial crisis. But not just in this economy, but also in the political system. How do we make certain institutions independent of political interference? I mean, for me, as a lawyer that comes from primarily a financial background, but also from a human rights background, I think a lot of us here have to accept that the economy is primary to get it right. Because the reality is that in Sri Lanka, no one would have come onto the streets demanding change if we didn't have 12-hour power cuts, if people weren't queuing for 10 days for petrol. They would bear the corruption which they've been bearing and voting for, mind you, for several decades. They were born everything. It is only because there was no electricity at home, it was hot, it was cooler to be outside protesting than baking inside. And that's the reality which got all of us onto the street. But that's good, because we were able to do the difficult changes which we haven't done for a long time, right? So first thing, change the central bank. Right? That's where a lot of the financial economic problems of this country, when you really look at from the time the central bank was set up in the 1950s, Sri Lanka has been in constant economic and financial crisis since then. Not as deep as 2022, but it's been a history. Why? Because the central bank is like the government's unlimited supply of cash. Right? It keeps deficit financing. It has the Ministry of Finance as part of its board and decision making. So it follows those diktats. Since the central bank was set up in the 1950s till today, well, till 2022, the Sri Lankan currency has depreciated by 3,000%, like something ridiculous like that. That's the amount of income which people have lost unknowingly, unconsciously. So we need to fix that.
I think we are very conscious about it.
But are we really, have we? You know, we love deficit financing, and that's what this country has been doing, running big deficits and printing gazillions of rupees. And we saw from 2020 till 2022, Sri Lanka had printed trillions and trillions of rupees. During those 2 years, we printed more money than we had ever printed in the last 70 years, right? That was the amount of money we printed to finance this deficit. So we fixed that. So no more money printing, no more deficit financing. The central bank is independent. The governor is appointed by the Constitutional Council. There is no finance minister or finance ministry representative in the board of the central bank. And the sole focus of the central bank is inflation targeting, right? There's a set figure for what its target should be. It's been 5% for the last 3 years. We have consistently missed the target by actually having inflation lower than the target. So the last few years, our inflation has been hovering at negative to now 1%. So actually, it's a good thing. So there were other reforms, changes that we did. We passed a Financial Responsibility Act. There's a Debt Management Office Act. There's a Parliamentary Budget Office Act, which I'm particularly proud of. Now, most people don't know about the Parliamentary Budget Office because it's still being operationalized, but it's an independent office which is only accountable to Parliament. Its role is that every time government comes up with fanciful proposals or budget proposals saying, we're going to start some new project, we're going to spend this much on something, we're going to give freebies and goodies, this independent office is able to actually do an independent costing of how much is actually going to cost the taxpayer. And then it's going to communicate to the public, well, this is the cost of this proposal, this is how you're going to finance it. Either we have to tax you more or we have to raise more debt, right? So it gives that kind of information. And then during election time, the Parliamentary Budget Office has the power to do those same costings for political parties' manifestos. So you can independently give an opinion to the public that these manifesto proposals are actually whether Sri Lanka has the money to give that, and if we don't have the money, how much extra tax we have to raise or how much debt we have to raise. So those are some of the key changes we did.
Thank you, Aritha. I wanted to ask Dr. Harinda. So, from a layman's point of view, you wake up, Bangladesh seems to be working okay, and all of a sudden there's a, protest. Same in Nepal. It just comes like, you open CNN, you see like this coming. But as we know, we are seeing this actually, these are not movements that happen overnight for a long period of time. I would love for you to, discuss about what are some key things to see, where do you see it happening or boiling even right now, and particularly in the other countries. We don't, if you can discuss about this particular point.
Oh, yeah. I think these protest movements, if you go back, take 21st century as a benchmark. I would say most of the current protest movements kind of, the inspiration probably was 2009, 2010. That is kind of the rupture point. It's because I think the world changed, the time changed, inspiration changed, the demands, expectations changed, but the political structure did not change. I'll unpack it in a second. So I always see the Arab Spring as a kind of a breakaway. It's not just the Arab Spring, it's also the political uprisings that took place across even parts of Eurasia, even Ukraine. But the Arab Spring is an interesting point because that's where you got this one thing. First thing is the slogans of democracy and governance coming in strongly. accountability coming in strongly, and the fact that we have enough of dictatorships, right? It can be democratic dictators or autocrats. We have enough. So that particular messaging was very powerful. And also, mind you, there are very interesting subtle difference. You know, it's 2025. So if you just look at the global population, I think it's more than half millennials and Gen Z. So when the Arab Spring happened, it was millennial-led. So what's happening in the last few years is kind of not Gen Z-led, but Gen Z kind of driven. So there are some deep differences between the characteristics of the two. And two, they also share certain commonalities. One of the concerns of global political uprisings, mainly in the Arab, Central Asia, and then coming to South Asia, is the fact that do these have staying power? With the exception of Sri Lanka. That's what I think what Bhavani was getting at, saying about the history of activism. But one of the challenges in the context and the concerns I think we have is that the world has moved into a bit of a unstable situation. If you sum up all these uprisings, it's because of two things. Growing debt in many countries and youth bulges. When you bring that together, that is where I also want to refer to your 2048. The biggest problem in the world, it's that, you know, youth are looking at ahead and seeing no future. No proper jobs, no proper employment, no proper hope of having a good life. And then they see who's to be blamed, the established political system. That is why in the last 5 years, what I see is the fast and furious of the protests since the last 5 years, kind of which started with the 2010 wave. The last 5 years was rapid, but then the concern is how much does that political protest, uprisings, actually account for political transformation into tangible outcomes that create institutions, that creates norms, and that creates the actual systems change or the reset, you can say it in any way. So that is one of the challenges we face, because globally there is an unraveling taking place. Globally, the ethos of liberal internationalism, liberal institutions is under assault. I would like to quote the long-standing advice of the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel in the aftermath of the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance's speech early this year to the European security community. He said, and he literally cried after in this response. He said, the system we have now can be disrupted. It has all its demerits. It can be disrupted. It can be destroyed. But it's really going to be impossible to rebuild. Same goes in a micro sense for countries as well. Whatever you disrupt, destroy, in what form can you build? I think Sri Lanka is an exception. We have managed to come out actually stronger, and you can see there is institutional process. This is what Aritha was trying to bring out. You can't have proper political transition without institutions. So that's a conversation we need to have in the future as well.
Yeah. Well, I want you guys to think about some of the questions. I'm going to come soon to the audience, but I wanted to ask about this idea. With this kind of narrative, how do we see, when we were discussing this earlier, you were asking, can we have a Obama moment happen or a Mamdani moment happen, right? And why, I mean, just to unpack, like, why is it even happening, right? So I would love for you, it's an open question, any one of you guys can take it. In your own countries, how would a Mamdani kind of an opportunity happen? Or what can we learn from that about how the Gen Z, millennial, new groups are looking at voting and governance and democracy and their futures?
So I think we've had a moment in 2022, and I think that, I mean, I don't want to call it who by name, but the Aragala opened up the spaces that, I mean, the reforms Aritha spoke about came from that. People were getting impatient and they didn't want to see a repeat of what we went through. And I think this is going back to the whole point about when democracy is backsliding, people do come together. It's just the articulation might be very different. But I think what's important is while there may be moments, how do you sustain the reform, the trajectory? And for genuine democratic transformation, it takes decades. I think that kind of needs to be realized in terms of these things are not going to happen overnight. The conversation about abolishing the executive presidency, bringing checks and balances in Sri Lanka has been there for decades. It's not a new conversation. But what happened in 2022 made people realize there is a connection in terms of authoritarian governance to economic prosperity and growth. And for that to happen, you need the checks. You need checks and balances, transparency, accountability, but a government and governance structure that relates to the people. If you have something that is very far from the people, that's going to be something that is going to lose momentum. So I think one lesson, I don't think there's a individual in Sri Lanka, and I want to stay away from that. Let's not create these individuals alone. It's about systems. It's about systems that go beyond a particular year or a decade. And that's the important thing. And that's why it's so important to look at the work done in the past, but also utilize social media and other tools that get the message across. But Pial's point about, social media can also be weaponized. And I think that's important. While it's used to get the message out, to expose things, to raise awareness, that alone cannot sustain a long-term vision. And that's important to find the different tools.
Point. So when you say Mamdani moment, what is a Mamdani moment? If you sort of dissect that, and I think it's connected to what Bhavani was saying as well as Dr. Harinda, he was basically able to listen to the audience, the constituents in New York, deep listening, identifying two or three. I mean, none of us currently, or at least none of us on this panel, live in New York, but we all, three of us and all five of us could actually recite the three things he was talking about, rent, affordability, free bus, and all that stuff. So simplicity in messaging, it doesn't have to be individual, it could certainly be collective, but connecting with the end user. I know someone earlier talked about customer experience in a different context, but that piece is important, understanding your end user. But the one part where I do slightly respectfully disagree with Bhavani, that of course I recognize that systems are critical, but you also need an individual, oftentimes a single individual at the right time, right moment, to take some sort of an extra step. So that's what I sort of think of when you say Mamdani moment. In addition to the systems, which are critical, but you need a person to step up and do this for us and get people together, and then it's then a collective effort.
Yeah, just to clarify, I'm not saying individuals don't matter. I don't think it should be only an individual. I think individuals with a bigger initiative, party, or a movement is critical. So it's one, but a larger force. Yeah.
I feel in Sri Lanka we've had the Mamdanis, right? We've had the Trumps. And, we've had those versions of nationalist, racist, homophobic, xenophobic, all of them we've had, or the super left-wing, inspirational, good speakers. And frankly, it hasn't really worked for us. Most of these sort of demagogue-style figures have used their influence and position to strip away these institutions and have made our country, our democracy, and finally our economy so much more weaker. So I'm very much in line with Bhavani that if, these sort of demagogic figures, if they're not about building institutions, if they're more about building themselves, then there is no future for this country. And we haven't had that future. And since 2022, what we've really been trying to do is building those institutions so that whatever demagogue that comes and goes, the country survives beyond them.
Absolutely. Let me get a chance to get the audience to ask some questions. What kind of a democracy you want to live in. Can you get somebody mic, please? Hi, Asoka.
Hi, thank you very much to the panel for those thoughts. My question is, with these young people movements, at the end of it, and I'm keen to get people's thoughts, both Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and if there are any thoughts from even beyond those two countries. After all of that, are there many young people's voices now being heard despite the young people driving these movements? I mean, and is that a cause for concern looking ahead? I'm conscious that, let's say in Sri Lanka, young people are having a lot of the bills of the country to pay to deliver social security elements, things like that, long into the future. And yet not many young people's voices are in sort of the mainstream political, public discourse. So any thoughts on that, I'd be glad to hear. Thank you.
Let me take a quick stab on Bangladesh and then maybe you can comment. So in Bangladesh, as I was trying to articulate in the presentation, post July 36, the government that was formed included 3 of those members in our cabinet. So they are very much part of the current interim government. Furthermore, the group it wasn't an organized group that began the movement over a period of time, but they have since formed a new political party. So beyond the 2 dynasties that have controlled our country for a long period of time, there is a new political party launched this year called NCP, National Citizens Party, that's largely a collection of many of these young leaders that were part of the movement. So we don't know, because it's still too early to see how successful they'll be, if they'll be able to implement the ideas that they talked about. But the transition has begun to some level. We just have to wait and see how they sustain or not.
In Sri Lanka, I can touch on something which we started. So one is that for local government elections, 25% of nominees for those councillor posts must be in the youth category, so people below 35. And actually just last week, we started a new initiative for piloting in the Western Province and in the Northern Province, a program called Youth in Local Governance. And what happens in that program is that in every local council, and this is where the governance gap is, right? This is where young people feel disconnected from governance, because the reality is most issues are at the local level. They're not at parliamentary or presidential level. Bread and butter issues are really at the local level. So for every local council, there has been appointed 2 youth focal points. They are youth elected councillors. 1 man, 1 woman, 1 person from the governing body side, from the governing party side, and the other focal point from the opposition in that local council. And those 2 focal points have to set up a youth advisory committee. So they comprise 10 young people from within the local area, and they have to be involved in the participation and in the governance of that local council and make contributions and consult on certain issues. So that's one way from an institutional perspective. The government is trying to address this sort of gap in youth participation and youth feeling of disenfranchisement from the electoral and the political system.
From a global and even a local perspective, one thing we always miss is the fact that how does this youth, what Ashoka asked about, what role they play? Historically in politics, we speak about social movements, political movements, right? But the whole hallmark of all these protests in the last 10, 15 years, thanks partly to social media and technology, they kept on calling themselves leaderless revolutions, leaderless uprisings. It took the spirit away from organizing. So it was spontaneous, it was short term. So the impetus to stay on a movement, the longevity of that was not the thing. That is also, I think probably the social dynamics, the characteristics, and also the fact that, I don't know, I think Aritha might be, or Bhavani might attest, might see this point, the political consciousness and the literacy. I mean, you can show thousands of heads, images of, 100,000s of people. How many of them actually have the political sense, the consciousness, the literacy to be part of that processes? So ultimately what happens is, when it dies down, political parties, movements take over. Sometimes that might be good. You might have youth being represented. Sometimes it may go back. Look at what happened to Egypt. I'm not criticizing Egypt. Egypt got rid of Mubarak. They had the Muslim Brotherhood, political Islam, democratic political Islam coming in, Islamic movement coming in. Now where are they? Now back to authoritarian leadership. General, former military general. It's not a criticism, but this is how it has gone. So a country which started this movement, Egypt, you had Wael Ghonim, the Google engineer, who kind of was the driver behind the mass uprising. Wael Ghonim, who kind of started that we are all Khalid Said, to a death, to a protester who died. Then only all that particular hashtag became global with other names. He's nowhere. So that peril is there. That's because of, I think, a generational feature as well as a factor that we should promote political literacy for young people. I think we have lost that in our education curriculum. To a certain extent, when we were growing up, we had political, kind of those things in our base. We basically knew what are civics. Now you go and ask the brightest kid about civics and governance, what knowledge do they have? So that's kind of my sense to it. Thank you.
Maybe the last word, since Safra is, her charming self in saying wrap it up. But Asoka, I think it's very important to recognize the last election, we had the highest number of new actors coming into parliament. And I think that kind of captures, there is a lot of interest, energy among young people. But the worry is, what are the opportunities? And I think a point we all need to recognize is the brain drain that has happened. So it's not just elected office. In different specters, in spheres, we're not having young people feeling there's a place or kind of a vision forward. And beyond these initiatives, there needs to be a bigger culture in them feeling there is something here to build on in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in other countries. So one thing I think is very important is to kind of look at the success stories to say, it takes a while, but these are the opportunities that you need to start somewhere and give them that hope and get people to also come back. And one of the things I think I'll end here is the fact the role of the diaspora also, in terms of a lot of young people from the diaspora are coming to get things started. So there are a lot of things we can look to in terms of building on, and maybe we can take it out of this and have a longer conversation, since Safra is really throwing daggers at us now.
One of the things I want to understand is, all of us here, 40, maybe 50 plus, there isn't a youth representation on this tape, on this. I mean what it is. But there are some students I know you mentioned in the room. I would love to hear from one of them, even for 30 seconds, their perspective on this discussion about youth movement and youth uprising, if we could indulge that for 30 seconds.
Safra's going to throw us out of the building.
I feel like youth representation is really important, but one thing I really think about is the fact that it can really be weaponized, especially in current politics, because what you can see happening, I think we've seen this throughout history with like the Red Army in China. It's like these are the target demographics, and often politicians use like the appeal of these demographics to like legitimize their campaigns. So I feel like that's a real problem in modern day, especially with like youth representation and stuff.
Well, thank you very much. On that note, we have to close. Okay, let me see. Cut her mic, Safra. Cut her mic. This is how we keep it.
Yeah, I also think it's interesting to see how the youth is changing the platforms in which political activity is happening. Social media, for example, is super polarizing, and I think it has been a huge proponent in just pushing the rhetorics that people want to hear, and people see what they want to see, and this continues to just mobilize and push forth like the different sides and opposite sides of the political spectrum. But looking at how the youth used social media in Nepal, for example, they effectively elected the female prime minister on a Discord call, and I think that is kind of amazing to see how the youth is starting to use these systems that were previously really polarizing to enact change. And I think it's important to look at how we can continue to do that looking forward to the future.
Thank you. May I ask you to come on and hand these guys some gifts? Put you to work, actually. Actually, she did help me volunteer earlier to organize. Come in. Thank you very much for the panel. Please give them a round of applause. Is our democracy still safe? Okay, good.